Hi, we're really glad you joined us today for the last of the webinars on fair use in the visual arts. Peter Yassi and I are here to answer your questions today. And we want to remind you that we're not going to do any backgrounder on fair use today. We're not going to give you any backgrounder on the code. But we want to remind you that the last 4 webinars are all available to you through your CAA account at the collegeart.org website. So you just need to log in with your CAA login, and please do review and feel free to share those materials as well with your colleagues. We're really thrilled. We've heard from a number of you this week as you've sent in comments and questions. Some of your comments really, were so kind. We really appreciate your interest. And we're really excited to see that some of you have already begun educating your colleagues and telling them about the code and getting other people to read it too. And we really, really think that that is going to be the crucial difference between the kind of crabbed and limited practice that we unfortunately were able to document pretty easily in the past, and what's going to happen as a result of having this code. So congratulations to you, and congratulations for sticking with us, and we are going to continue to go into the questions that you brought us. How we're going to spend this hour together is, first we're going to go into the questions that we received during this week. Second, we want to answer any questions you have. Feel free to enter those questions at any time on the questions. If they don't show up on our box, Michael, who is with us, Michael Goodman from College Art Association, is going to read them to us. We are going to give you the biggest question that we have and go into next steps and resources. So that's how we're going to spend our time. And of course, this is our reference guide. If we tell you nothing else of value today, the most valuable thing we will tell you is, this is your code, please read it. So here are questions that you asked. First of all, many of you asked, both in former webinars and this week, about questions, particularly people in museums, about questions of fair use when it's in marketing materials, when it's in a brochure that you're going to be giving out in the exhibition, and so on, when it's involved in some way membership or fundraising. And Peter, I'm going to turn it over to you.
And I think these questions are easily answered as far as the code is concerned. The code applies to museum materials, online and printed, which have a explanatory or analytic or expository purpose with respect to museum collections and activities, educational materials, and documentation of exhibitions and documentation of permanent collections, among others. The code literally in its terms does not apply to external fundraising and membership development activities. Now, that does not mean that fair use doesn't apply in those situations. What it means is that there wasn't a clear consensus within the members of the field who came together to make the code around that question, and so no such consensus is expressed here. So if you've got an idea for using material from the collection, copyrighted material, that is exclusively, and I want to stress exclusively, because there are obviously many kinds of dual purpose communications which do fall within the code, but if there is a use that is exclusively for fundraising purposes or exclusively for membership development, then that's something about which you should certainly have an internal conversation and probably involve anyone whose job it is to give you legal counsel.
Peter, I wanted to take that question just a little further, because somebody also said, well, what if we give a photo to the press, and the press just uses it almost like an illustration in their calendar section? They just put up a calendar announcement and use this picture. What do we do then?
I think you sit back happily knowing that you've done your best. In other words, if you have an exhibition coming up, if you are providing the press with a kit or with other material on the basis of which they can provide coverage. You're not in control of what coverage they provide. You, by seeking to provide substantive publicity for the exhibition, which is one of those dual purpose activities. It has both an explanatory purpose and, of course, if you're charging admission, an economic one as well. In the case of that kind of activity, which is covered by the code, if you've acted in good faith, well, the newspaper can make its own decisions about how to proceed, and will do so on the basis of its own good information.
So the big question that that people have asked us again and again is, you know, I understand that this work that is in the museum is in the public domain, and there's no reason why I should have to pay, but the museum is charging me a permission fee.
Yes.
To get at it anyway. So can the code help me there?
The code can help to an extent, but not, unfortunately, going with you the last mile. When I say the code can help to an extent, I really mean more accurately that the code document that we have provided and that's online can help, because that document includes a rather extensive introductory discussion of what is and isn't covered by the code itself. So I would urge you, as readers of the code, users of the code, and also as helpers of the project who may want to disseminate the code and encourage others to read it, to tell everybody that it's really kind of important to read the whole thing. They can skip the appendices if they want to, but the text of the code itself is really important, because it explains this issue. When a museum or an estate or any other holder of physical material says to you, I'm going to charge you money for a digital file of that material, or I suppose in the old days it would have been a transparency, you're in a difficult position. Because if you don't have access to the physical material that is satisfactory for your purposes, if you can't find a usable image elsewhere, then as the holders of the physical property, the museum or the estate or whoever it may be, can set their own terms. That has nothing to do with copyright. It's a function, if you want to sort of drive it back to its legal origins, it's a function of the law of real property or physical property. The fact that there is ownership of objects that's different from the ownership of the intellectual property that those objects may represent. So in that kind of a situation, unfortunately, you may have to pay that permission fee for access to usable image, or to image files of usable quality, even though A, the material in question is in the public domain, or B, you have an extremely good fair use basis for using that image, assuming that it's of the modern period, once you have acquired it. It's simply two different things. The only thing that's going to change the permissions fee problem, unfortunately, is a change in museum practice. We think that's happening. We see more and more museums giving up the practice of controlling carefully access to print quality reproductions of exhibition material, but that's what's going to have to bring about a change. Fair use in and of itself cannot do the work. And please continue.
Just to clarify, so I have a pretty good picture myself of this object that is in the public domain. If I use that picture, say in my scholarly article, the museum can't say you owe me a permissions fee anyway because you should have asked me.
Absolutely not. And the same would be true if that were a copyrighted work that you had found reasonable quality material relating to perhaps even on the internet. You know, we had a question about isn't the internet going to isn't make all of this irrelevant? I don't think so, far from it. I think the issues that we're talking about are likely to be more rather than less acute in general on the internet, the copyright issues. But it's possible that the increasing circulation of images of museum objects on the internet will gradually over time help to ameliorate this problem of permissions fees.
You know, Peter, one of the things I thought was so interesting, that report that we wrote when we interviewed people in museums, was that we discovered that most museums are not making money on permissions at all. In fact, almost everyone we talked to was losing money because it cost more to employ the person than the permissions fees they were getting.
Absolutely. If you happen to be in a museum that is still running an elaborate permissions operation and charging would-be users for access to images, you really, in my view, and this is a personal view rather than the view of the project, ought to be reevaluating that program, both from the standpoint of the cultural damage it may be doing and from a narrower fiscal standpoint to ask whether it really is making sense in your budget.
So moving on, and apologies, Peter, for rushing you through all these answers. But another question that came up, not just by one person, was, I'm pretty sure I understand that I have a fair use right to illustrate my academic article or my academic book, but I'm dealing with a publisher that says that there's just no room here. The publisher says, you know, you have to show that you have copyright or you got copyright permission for everything that you're using. Now what do I do?
Well, I think the answer is at two different levels, and let's start with the more granular one. We know from experience, not the experience of this project, which is very new, but the experience of the last 10 years, that publishers and other equivalent gatekeepers in various knowledge circulation systems often have strict policies and are willing to make particular exceptions to them on the basis of persuasion. So the first thing I would say is, if you've got a good fair use argument, despite your publisher's categorical boilerplate language, or despite what the first person you speak to on the telephone, who's likely to be an intern of some kind, tells you, don't begin by taking no for an answer. Because it's our experience that authors who press, both in journals and with book publishers, often discover that there is more actual flexibility beneath the hard surface of no than you might immediately imagine. The other, and this is the somewhat broader and longer term issue, and it's one that I want to return to at the end of the webinar today, is that we all, and I include us because it's part of what we're doing in the next couple of years, we all have a responsibility to try to get publishers to rethink these policies. And we are extremely hopeful that in the next months, we are going to see major publishers, both book and journal, revising their policies about image rights clearance. Not to say that you don't need any clearances ever, which would be silly, but to say that they will take grounded fair use arguments into account in making decisions about whether particular images need to be cleared. Now, that's going to be a process, like so many other things coming out of this code. Nothing is going to happen in terms of changing the field overnight, but the beginning will come with individual presses and individual journals that internalize what the code is telling them and take steps. And those people need our support. I'll answer a third question, which is, just speaking for myself, what I do with publishers under these circumstances. If all else fails, and it has once or twice in my career, and I can't do anything about it, I pull the article and find another publisher, which takes a certain amount of courage, but isn't impossible, and leaves a memory behind.
And I have to say that my own experience is that I have actually, having learned this from Peter, have been successfully able to get both journal publishers and an academic press, Oxford University Press, to accept my fair use claims. Although I did in both cases have to do some education, although people were in the end happy to get that education, and it was a conversation, but it worked. And I've also had Peter's experience of occasionally, I'm sorry?
This is a very useful educational document, and I
Yes.
recommend using it, and I recommend being prepared to talk about it once you have laid it down to the journal editor or the book editor in question. It can really help.
Yeah, it really makes a huge difference if instead of saying, well, I think it's fair use, to say, actually, I'm operating within the best practice of my field, and I would love to see, be able to do this with you. And so we've really had some remarkable experiences, particularly with the communication scholars, in having this happen, and we anticipated. But one thing that really actually thrilled me about last week's communications is we received comments from 2 journal editors, both of whom suggested that their real work was in educating their authors, who were often more resistant than they themselves were. So sometimes you may be lucky enough to encounter somebody who says, "Oh yes, I understand that argument."
Exactly.
So moving on, Peter, supposing I'm an art history teacher, as one of our correspondents was, who has been creative enough to develop a whole timeline, illustrated timeline for everybody who's teaching Art History 101, and who has no problem believing in the fair use legitimacy of using all those illustrations within the Art History 101 course time period and for the students in those classes. And what this person asked us was, I would really love to make this available throughout campus. Now, we've been able to make sure that if we put it up throughout campus, that it would only stay on campus. I mean, to the extent that one can do that with anything, but we can password protect and we can boundary protect to make sure that this is only available to staff, faculty, and students on campus. But would it be legitimate to make it available throughout campus?
I love this question because, first of all, it sounds like a wonderful project, and second, it raises something very, very important about the code and gives us an opportunity to explain it again. The principles of the code, their associated limitations, represent points on which the field was able to come to a strong and robust consensus. And where education was concerned, most of the focus of discussion, as you may imagine, was on the use of materials for both direct teaching and classroom support in particular classes. And so the teaching principle recommends as a best practice that in general the materials prepared for particular courses be limited in access to students for those courses. But as any good lawyer will tell you, there's a lot packed into the 2 words in general. And this gives us an opportunity to make again the point that is so important, and that is that fair use doesn't stop at the boundaries of the code, but rather that the good habits, we hope, of thinking about fair use that are represented in the code can be extended to situations which the code itself doesn't literally anticipate, like making basic art history information available throughout campus. Now, if I were counseling someone individually about this question, I would sit down with them and I would say, why are you doing this? Because remember, the key to thinking about fair use is whether or not the use fulfills a so-called transformative purpose. And if they were to say, and I'm not suggesting that any responsible person would say this, but if they were to say, oh, we think it'd be fun, or we'd like to show students that they're getting a little something extra for their tuition dollars, I would say, probably not a transformative purpose. Probably not a good fair use rationale for going forward with this project. But if, for example, the respondent were to say, the art history department, in collaboration with other university officials, has decided that there's a general deficit in basic knowledge about the history, the history of art that amounts to a literacy gap in our undergraduate students. And we think that by promulgating and making this available to students rather than to non-students, we can help, even for non-enrolled students, to close that literacy gap and to make it possible for everyone on campus to talk a little more intelligently and a little more groundedly about art as it relates to whatever work they are doing. That sounds like a really good explanation of a transformative purpose. And then, of course, one would have to ask, well, when you get to the 20th century, which is, of course, the only point in this art history timeline that you actually have to worry about, are you using, are you using, appropriate imagery to illustrate your points? Is there too much? Is there too little? All of those good operationalizing fair use questions, my guess is that they could be answered in the happy affirmative with respect to a project of this kind. So that's how I would proceed to work through this, despite the fact that it is literally not covered by the code. And I would begin again, and I want to reemphasize that, if I were counseling someone, by pointing out that the code is a great guide to the most common recurrent situations in the field, but that fair use does not stop at the edges of the 5 principles. Rather, the modes of thinking that the code illustrates can be extended to new situations.
So Peter has just modeled for you the reasoning process, and he's done it for something that is just outside the edges of the code. But this is exactly the kind of reasoning process that you're going to go through with the stuff that is in the code as well, because each situation you're looking at will be one in which you have to work through those same questions. We're going to move a little quicker through this last 4 questions.
We talked a moment ago about making arguments to publishers. Well, this is also what you do when you make an argument to a publisher. You don't walk in and pound the table literally or figuratively and say, this is fair use and I want it. You explain. And you explain using the technique of explanation, which we've just been modeling as a technique of analysis. I see the next question, and it's a good one, and it's a common one. And that is whether all this stuff about fair use works for orphan works. Now, I think everybody knows the definition of an orphan work. It's a work that's sort of presumably or presumptively copyrighted, new enough to be in that status, but which doesn't have anyone who can be found, an author or a survivor or an agent, who's actively, or even for that matter, inactively involved in exploiting it, providing licensing and whatever. And there are a lot of them out there. Some are ephemera, some aren't, some are text, many are image. And the answer to this is once again a two-step or two-level answer. The first answer is easy, and that is yes. Everything in the code and everything about the process of reasoning that the code models is fully applicable to orphan works. The question, which is more interesting, I think, is whether there are any advantages in fair use analysis when you're considering the use of an orphan work rather than a work that has a known potential licensor. And the answer to that question, I want to say, is at least tentatively, again, yes. Why? Because lurking in the background of fair use analysis is always this question of, well, is there anybody who's going to be terribly harmed if I do this? Not an important question, not a foreground question these days, but a background question, and certainly something that comes up sometimes. And of course, if there's nobody around who is actively or passively involved in making money off this work, who is attempting to license it or could even willing to license it, the definition of an orphan work, then it's awfully hard to see how your measured professionally contextualized use of that work could conceivably do anyone any economic harm. So I think, in fact, that sometimes the fair use arguments are better, marginally, but not trivially better for orphan works than they are for works in general.
Michael, I just want to ask you, we're not seeing any questions having come up. Has anyone submitted questions?
Yes.
Michael?
Yes, can you hear me?
Okay. Then I think, Peter, we only have a couple of minutes left. Why don't you pick the questions you want to answer?
The answer to the next one it's a two-part question, and the answer to the first part is yes. That's simple. And the harder question is how to attribute, and the answer is appropriately, according to the code, which in a podcast means informally, but with the essential basic information. That is, to the extent known, the name of the work, and of course, the artist or other creator responsible for the work. A date of creation would be nice. If you have it, it's often of interest, as you know. Under no circumstances is it appropriate to include information in such an attribution where a fair use is involved, referencing a copyright owner or agent that holds itself out as the licensing authority for the work. By doing so, in fact, you create a potential problem, and that is that estate or ARS or whoever it is could come back to you and say, you're suggesting by your attribution that we licensed that to you. It's not true. We didn't. You made a fair use. So for heaven's sake, leave that information out of the attribution and simply concentrate on what it would be professionally appropriate to tell the world about what this work is and who made it.
How about U.S. and you're in the U.S. but you're using international stuff?
Yes, 1,000 times yes. The U.S. law controls uses in the U.S. and it is one of the most common and most understandable misconceptions in this field that somehow works of foreign origin carry with them into the United States some of their foreign characteristics. That is not the case. International copyright operates, and again, the sort of the background material in the code pamphlet is very useful on this point. International copyright operates on a background principle of so-called national treatment. French work gets exactly the same kind of treatment in the United States that an equivalent U.S. work would have, and vice versa.
So we only have like 90 seconds. Let's do our poll, shall we? The appropriation poll.
That would be fun. In other words, many of you ask variants of the question, where is this train about appropriation art going to stop? What are the limits? And of course, we don't know. We know what the community said were important limits, of which perhaps the very most important is that if an artist uses pre-existing copyrighted material in a new work, they have to be prepared to explain why and to what extent that use was justified. They have to step up and describe their purpose. But only time is going to tell. Maybe time and the mischievous career of Richard Prince, who seems to be pushing us from one limiting case to another faster than we can catch up. Maybe only those developments are going to tell exactly how far it goes. We do have, however, and Pat is going to show, an example of a divisive case. This is one of the Mr. Brainwash cases from the District Court in the Central District of California. On the right, we have the original photograph, the plaintiff's photograph of Sid Vicious. On the left, we have Mr. Brainwash's rendition thereof, And this case was brought and decided, although the decision was not appealed, so what the court had to say, and it's not a very good opinion, to be honest, not a very thoughtful opinion, isn't a very much precedential value, but it's an interesting thing to test ourselves on. And both now and later on, if you were to want to think about it, to go back to the code and to say, how does the code apply to this reuse? But let's find out what you think now.
So, Michael, could you launch the poll? And the question is, could you apply does fair use explain why this is okay to not license? Could you not license this and say this was fair use? And Michael, if you have launched the polls, we're not able to see it.
I am seeing it, actually.
I have launched it. Mm-hmm.
Even though I'm not able to participate because I'm not allowed to participate.
I am not seeing it. So, Peter, you will tell me.
Only, it says.
Pardon?
It says activities only.
And how many people have voted?
That I don't see.
You don't see what the percentage of votes has been?
I can tell you 52%, 72%, 74% have voted.
Ooh.
Great. Okay, so let's close the poll, and you tell me, Michael, what the results are.
I'm sharing it. Can you see it on the screen?
No.
The poll results. Actually, yeah. Peter can see it.
Yes, 52% yes, 21% no, and a healthy and probably correct 27% saying I'm not sure. I say correct because, of course, what we don't know and what would be crucial in terms of applying the code to this image is what the story is, what statement or rationale about transformative purpose was articulated in the case. So I think this is just about where it should be in equipoise. And unfortunately, I can't tell you, you're welcome to look, but I can't tell you that the court opinion in the case is going to add very much to your deep understanding. As it turned out, for your information, the fair use defense failed in this case. But there are reasons to think that that was not necessarily a strongly precedential result. So take a look, see what you think.
So we've given you a liminal case, and we've given you a case in which the story that was told was not a powerful story. So exactly. This is now the point at which we want to know what you want to know, and we're going to depend on Michael. My whole question screen is blank. Michael, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I will read through a few at a time.
Great. Keep on going.
How can we apply the code to assignments for students that involve creating publicly available websites or blogs that contain images, including works that may be under copyright? This may include photography that the students have taken themselves in museums.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Next question. Sorry. I am a former filmmaker who's now a film professor. I always use classic and contemporary DVDs in my teaching, transforming those that I use by demonstrating their visionary relevance for my students, plus interesting them in viewing and purchasing these DVDs. I'm also creating various DVDs along with my commentaries. However, even though this work is transformative, I take it that I'm not allowed to profit commercially from this work. Is that correct?
Okay, keep on going.
In creating a descriptive bibliography of a contemporary writer who donated the collection to our library's special collections, would scans of the book covers fall under fair use for online access to the bibliography via our library website? The book jackets were not created by the author.
So book covers and scans of the book covers, and what's being done? by the library?
As they're being used as
online access to the bibliography,
to the contents or to the bibliographic details.
And the library has built the bibliographies.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, keep on going.
Actually, let's perhaps take one more, and then
Okay.
I'd like to
I'll read one more. Following up on this question of access to digital images and permission fees, how does this all relate to database providers of images like ArtStore that have very conservative/restrictive licenses on what you can do with their images? Usually this is because of the conservative permissions they originally got from the original rights holder. Can you argue for usage under the code against a license?
Great. Okay, Peter, which of these Sterling questions would you like to pick first?
Let's start at the end, because the last question has a one-word answer. It's no, and that's why you have to be awfully careful about what licenses you enter into. Fair use is a powerful right, but it's waivable, and more people enter into, and institutions enter into more licenses that casually waive fair use than they imagine. So whoever does the licensing for your institution ought to be on the lookout. Now, if a resource is available only subject to a restrictive license, then a calculus has to be made about whether that is a resource worth having subject to those conditions. But often, surprisingly, perhaps not in the case of an art store, but in others, it is possible to negotiate these terms. Again, it's very much like what we were saying earlier about publishers. The given terms of a license are not necessarily the final terms of a license. So find the person who does your licensing and educate them about the code and what can be lost by entering casually into restrictive licenses. The case of the descriptive bibliography is a very interesting one. We don't have enough information to answer, but the lack of information that I note is, I think, instructive in its own right, and that is, we don't know why the library wants to use those book covers. We don't know what their story is about why this resource will be more useful, more culturally beneficial if the book covers are used than if the titles are given without image. And if the answer is, well, it'll make the site look a little more colorful, that's probably not a good answer. So this is very much like the example we talked about earlier, where a lot depends on the way in which the purpose is understood and articulated.
You know, one of the things that we saw with documentary filmmakers is that when we were working with them, is they often turn to it'll be more lively in my film, and you know that would be often true too. But the argument that they needed to stick with was, I have a transformative purpose. I need to do this to tell my story better. And the fact that it will be more colorful or that it will be attractive or engaging is not something that would detract from the fair use argument. But you still have to have the fair use argument.
Exactly.
But we often found them saying, well, that, you know, then would I be safer if I picked something that was uglier or less attractive?
No.
And we would say, pick the stuff you need to tell the story the best. And because you are a documentary filmmaker, you're telling stuff about things that are true. And so make sure that you stick to the part about, I want to tell what's really going on. And
it's very important. In other words, you don't get very far in this business by making up rationales after the fact, even though they are clever ones. You do a lot better by knowing before the fact why you're doing something, and then remembering or writing down or otherwise memorializing what you had in mind, just in case, in the extremely unlikely case, but just in case somebody should call you on it.
Yes, exactly. Oh, and I just wanted to make the point that having something be attractive and interesting is not a negative.
It's not a negative, but it is not, I think we would agree, sufficient in itself.
No, that's what I wanted to say, is that you wouldn't want it, you can't hang your hat on that. But
Exactly.
You don't want to take it off the table for use because it is.
What's your story? Now, the first of the questions is an extremely interesting one because it involves student work assigned in a classroom context. My understanding is that the assignments involve asking students to create presentations which mix up a variety of various kinds of materials, some of which may be copyrighted. And if you look at the second principle of the code, teaching about art, you don't, I think, find there any very specific guidance with respect to this issue. The second principle, because this is where the main concerns of the field were, focuses on the behavior of teachers as teachers. If, on the other hand, and this is one of the most important things about using the code creatively, and that is you have to think of the different principles of the code as being mutually supporting of one another and not exclusive. If you look at the third principle of the code, which has to do with making art, it strikes me that what those students are being asked to do is, in effect, to make their own pastiche works pursuant to the classroom assignment. And the making art principle, which, as we know, is broadly and flexibly stated, would, I think, arguably, and again, it's up to you to do the hard work of going through and applying the relevant limitations, but arguably there is space, even potentially plenty of space, in the third principle, supported indirectly by the second principle, to justify or explain that activity. It doesn't necessarily matter, in other words, whether the student work is going to be kept in-house or whether it is going to go on the open web on some kind of content platform. Nor, to approach the last of the questions, not last in order, but the last in terms of my treatment of them, nor does it matter to someone that if someone is developing teaching materials, that they may have a present or future intention of commercializing those materials. Most of the work of the visual arts community with which we dealt in this document, with which CAA dealt in this document, is non-commercial in character, or at least can arguably so be characterized, but not all of it. If I write a scholarly book, that book is going to be sold, and because that book is sold, even though it may never make a dime, it's a commercial activity. So there is no, and I can't say this strongly enough, emphatically enough, if there is one circulating misunderstanding about fair use that we really should banish now from the discussion, it is this notion that fair use only works when there's no money involved. Far from it. Most of the successful historical invocations of the fair use doctrine over 175 years in the U.S. courts have been by commercial makers. Record companies, publishers themselves, artists who sell their work for hundreds and thousands of dollars, all successfully invoke fair use, and so can a teacher who hopes sometime to make a modest amount of money by selling the curriculum materials he or she is developing.
So this is also where I think it's very helpful for you to find out what are best practices in related fields.
Yes.
So the film professor has a terrific guide in the documentary filmmaker's statement of best practices in fair use for themselves. And of course, documentary filmmakers work entirely within a commercial environment. And so that's helpful to him. media literacy professors, when they created a code of best practices in media literacy, were very, very concerned with student behavior because they want their students to create works of media literacy using existing cultural products. Mm-hmm. And they want their students to be able to compete in contests that leave the school. They want their students' work to be able to be seen on local cable access stations and so on. And so they were very careful to write clauses in their code about student work. So the logic of these codes is all shared. And they're all available on our site as well. I'm sorry.
Now, I'm interested, Pat, we know, and Michael, is that material linked at the CAA site?
Yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Good. Because then even if you're starting at CAA, you can easily find your way to the comprehensive documentation of the 10 or so other codes that exists at the site that Pat's groups maintain.
So we are moving along from your questions, but Michael is going to give us all the other questions that you submitted so that we can provide responses that will be shared with the community that's been listening to these webinars. But we are now at the point where we would like to ask you our question. And this is the question number one that we have. This is our most important question. We want to know how we can help you in changing the work that you do and the culture that you live in with fair use. You wouldn't be on this podcast if you didn't care. And you are somebody who makes a difference in your world. You're a big node on your network, as we say, because you are somebody who has joined College Art Association and who has attended this webinar. So, and we know that some of you are sitting in groups watching this webinar and are having conversations among yourselves. So we would like to hear from you, and Michael will help us with those questions about what will help you best. And while we're waiting for his questions, we're just going to give you a little bit of heads up on what we think that you could do as very first steps. We think that you could use the code. We think that you could turn to a colleague the minute you leave this webinar and tell them about the code. Really, I think the most important thing that we have to do in this phase of the code is, and I can hear someone typing. I don't know if that's you, Michael. The most important thing is actually to read the code yourself. But once you've moved beyond that, tell a colleague, and build it into your teaching. When you have those communications with the publisher or with somebody in the museum or with your interlocutor, perhaps a general counsel, feel free to share materials there. And if you know a group that would like to endorse the code, we would love to know that. We want to take you also to this site of the Code of Best Practices because there are resources we've pointed out before, including an infographic that's very copyable. We have a video, it's a 7-minute video, and we cannot, my best student did this video, you will love it.
Very neat.
Yeah, even though we're in it, we have to endorse it. Uh-oh, I think I just lost. Oh, because we went to YouTube, darn it. And one of the most important things for you, here are some questions you can test your students' knowledge with as well as your own. That can be a little class exercise, and you have the answers there as well. But here's a resource. These frequently asked questions, and one of the reasons they're a resource is we think that we might be able to expand these questions, each of which has a significant body of answers behind it. If you ask us questions that we hear repeatedly and that are not already here, we want to be able to add them, and we can add as many as we like because it's the internet.
That's right. This is a dynamic document. Unlike the code, which is going to stay the way it is for a while, this document can and we hope will evolve.
And the questions that you have, we have a set of steps. The first of all, There's a question in the FAQ that answers your question, and you can try out some situations, and you can read more materials. We have a set of stepped resources. Oh, I didn't point out the PowerPoint, but we have a whole PowerPoint that has notes so that you don't even have to improvise if you don't want to in educating other people. But here is what we love, telling other people to handle this job. When you click on New York office at collegeart.org, you will go to a mail website, and you will be able to send a message to Janet Landay, who's accumulating the questions, and it will be able to either get you answers or get your question to us. So, Michael, do we have questions about how we can help?
Or answers, even.
Comments, mostly. You already have by giving me the word and the idea of being transformative. It just helps to hear you provide right thinking, so we respond in the best way possible to our faculty and students. I'm a librarian who serves as the copyright agent. Your audience is perhaps broader than you think. Thanks. Okay. Can you somehow...
If I could interrupt a moment and just say that I'm delighted that there are librarians in the audience. We love librarians. And one of the most recent and most fully developed and powerful and effective of these codes of best practices is of course, the Association of Research Libraries Code for Best Practices in Academic Libraries, also endorsed by ACRL and ALA and a lot of others. So if you're a library professional and don't know that document, I'd recommend reading it in conjunction with this one, because it will give you a lot of other consistent cross-bracing ideas.
And I've just gone to that site. It's an amazing document. It has had an extraordinary history already in changing practice in libraries, and the librarians have breakout.
It has another thing in common with our code, and that is that it was also funded by the Mellon Foundation. And as we begin to wind up these webinars, we also ought to do what we do on every public occasion, which is to thank the Mellon Foundation for its generous support of this project and the Crest Foundation for essential startup funding, without which the project would not have been possible.
Excellent. And just going back to our librarian friend, note that we have some wonderful deep dive ARL, Association of Research Library briefings here for people who kind of want to get into it. All right. Other questions? Other comments, Michael, or questions?
Here's one more comment. Can you somehow access general libraries as well as art libraries to share this information with the directors? This should also be done for the IT department leader. If you are going to educational institution, I find that these people have personal assets and are very concerned they will be sued if others at the institution break fair use. Our IT group insists that if something is put on Blackboard for one semester, fair use must be obtained in order for IT to put it up for the following semesters. Perhaps this is too conservative. I find that the higher up the person's permission, the more conservative they are.
So I think what they mean is that the IT people are saying you need permission if you put it up for more than one semester, and I think Peter can explain why you don't need to go along with that. I'm going to access the part of the librarian's code that helps with that problem.
So they could be saying one of two things, and if they were saying one of those things, they would at least technically be right, and that is that we do have to think from time to time about whether the fair use rationale for any use we're making in a university or library setting still remains valid, because on some occasions it doesn't. Your objectives change, and we all know that sometimes things remain in our syllabus after we have really stopped teaching them. So there is some there is an imperative, not semester to semester, of course, but year to year or eon to eon, to make sure that your original fair use justification still holds. If they mean, and I suspect they do, Pat is right about that, if you use it for more than one semester, you have to license it, then they're wrong. And the history of why they're wrong is a long, rich, complicated, ugly one, but it has to do with something called the classroom photocopying guidelines that were part not of the Copyright Act, but of the legislative history of the Copyright Act of 1976, and that copyright owners have been trying ever since to press on the Academy as a general set of limitations on fair use in all settings and contexts, including the new electronic course support context. And we know from, among others, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in the Georgia State case that that's just not going to work. That if those guidelines have any remaining relevance with respect to quaint practices like printed courtsbacks, which are not before us here, but which I might argue they do not, in fact, apply to, or at least not in the way that publishers insist, they're irrelevant in the electronic environment. So this is what you've got there is an educational test. And I'm not sure that I agree with your generalization, that the higher you go, the worse it gets. I actually think that it's sometimes the decision makers who are sort of squeezed between the users, the end users, who are pressing them on the one hand, and supervisors who they perceive as being conservative on the other hand, who are in the hardest place, and that means including the IT people, and are therefore the most inflexible. If I were on a campus where this difficulty were in place, what I would be trying to do is to organize a meeting with the IT people and some of the higher-ups as well, general counsel, who may well understand this much better than anyone else, or somebody from the provost's office, somebody who remembers that the university or the library has a mission other than covering itself in case of the remote likelihood of liability. So you've got a job to do. There are lots of resources that we've given you to help do that job. And if indeed in your institution there is an opening and you think a possibility of doing some effective persuasion, we'd love to hear about that and to help with it as well.
So what I'd like to do is just to make sure that you have this, these two emails, these two URLs. This one deals with the visual arts, but if you wanted to see all of the fair use stuff, you, instead of writing visual arts, you would just write fair use any way you want to. And this is your collegeart.org site, which is also, you can go to the collegeart.org site. Don't forget to rewatch any of these webinars, or to have one of your colleagues watch it. And we would be glad for you to share these materials as widely as you like. And here is the way to reach our good friend Janet Landay, who has been the unbelievably patient and stalwart project manager for College Art Association on this project for the last 2 years, and for the next 2 years we'll continue to be responding to your queries and being in touch with us on a daily and weekly basis to make sure that the field is getting educated. That will not happen, of course, without your taking that really crucial first step. We realize that the field is in a situation where a lot of this information is new, and it's going to make a huge difference. The way that people change is that they hear something from somebody they know and they trust, and that's you. And so we really want to support you in that endeavor, and also to hear your stories. We are posting those stories on our blogs, on the in the CAA newsletter that comes out weekly, and the CMSI, my own website's blog, which a newsletter which comes out monthly, and we're telling your stories. We'd love to hear from you. So thank you so much.
Thank you all very much. It's been great fun. You've been extremely patient. I'm sorry that we have to stop meeting like this. But
all right.
There will be more, and please watch these spaces that we've described, interesting developments over the next couple.
Great. Thank you all. Bye-bye.